In the ancient world, death was never the end. It was a performance. And few performances were as horrifying as that of Marcus Atilius Regulus, Rome's most tragic hero. Once a decorated general and symbol of Roman virtue, Regulus would meet an end so cruel it was whispered even among executioners. Captured by Carthage, betrayed by politics, and condemned by honor, he was not executed with sword or cross, but by something far worse. He was lowered alive into a boiling cauldron of oil, his flesh melting as the crowd cheered. This is not legend. It is one of the oldest recorded tortures in Roman history, a story of loyalty twisted into punishment, and of how Rome turned its greatest hero into a warning. Before his name became a whisper of agony, Marcus Atilius Regulus was the embodiment of Roman greatness. He had risen from soldier to consul during the First Punic War, commanding vast legions against Carthage, Rome's greatest rival across the sea. The Senate adored him. His victories were carved into marble, his discipline the measure by which others were judged. He was Rome's perfect man, stern, loyal, unbreakable. But the Roman Republic was not kind to its heroes. Behind the Senate's applause lay envy, fear, and ambition. Every victory planted new enemies in marble halls. Regulus was a man of principle in an age when principles were dangerous. He fought not for wealth or conquest, but for duty, and that made him both revered and despised. When he sailed for Africa in 256 BCE, Rome expected conquest. Carthage expected annihilation. Regulus delivered both. His armies swept through the Punic territories with ruthless precision. Villages burned, temples crumbled, and Carthaginian generals were dragged through the dust. The Romans believed the gods themselves favored Regulus. They called him Invictus, the unconquered. But the gods are fickle. Carthage, desperate and cornered, called upon a Spartan mercenary commander, Xanthippus, a man foreign to their soil but skilled in Roman warfare. In a single brutal engagement near Tunis, Regulus' army was shattered. Tens of thousands of Romans were slaughtered or enslaved. Regulus himself was captured, a prize worth more than gold. The Carthaginians had taken Rome's symbol of invincibility and placed him in chains. For a time they did not kill him. They paraded him instead, bound, gaunt, and unbent, through the markets of Carthage. Children threw stones. Merchants spat. Priests offered thanks to Baal-Hamon, their god of fire. Yet Regulus did not kneel. To his captors, that silence was an insult greater than any word. Meanwhile in Rome, politicians celebrated his past victories while conveniently forgetting his fate. Prisoners of war were tools of diplomacy, and Regulus was no exception. His capture became a bargaining chip, one that would soon drag him back into the political arena that had long ago betrayed him. But even then, in that Carthaginian cell, he was a Roman to the bone. He wrote letters of duty, prayed to the household gods he could no longer see, and refused to eat food offered by his enemies. The man who once commanded legions now slept beside vermin, yet his pride remained sharper than the swords that had failed to save him. In ancient Rome, honor was a weapon, and Marcus Atilius Regulus would soon discover it cut both ways. His story was far from over. The chains around his wrists were not his punishment, but the beginning of a torment that would outlive empires. For in the struggle between Rome and Carthage, no man suffered more for his virtue than the general who refused to surrender. The chains that bound Marcus Atilius Regulus were not forged merely from iron. They were forged from humiliation. The proud general who once commanded 30,000 soldiers now shuffled barefoot through the dust of Carthage, his body wasted by exhaustion and sun. Yet it was not the pain of captivity that tormented him most. It was the knowledge that his defeat would be celebrated by men who once trembled at his name. The Carthaginians had long thirsted for revenge. For years, Regulus had scorched their lands, slaughtered their sons, and desecrated their shrines. Now the conqueror stood stripped of armor and dignity, reduced to spectacle. He was paraded through the city streets as a symbol of divine retribution, proof that even Rome's greatest could bleed and beg. Ancient accounts speak of the silence that fell as he passed. Some spat in his path, others hurled curses in the name of Baal-Hamon and Tanit, gods who demanded vengeance by fire. But the Roman did not bow. His gaze remained fixed ahead, unflinching, his silence more defiant than any outcry. To his captors, this unbroken composure was infuriating, the insolence of a man who refused to acknowledge defeat. Regulus was confined to a stone cell near the harbor, where the stench of salt and decay mixed with the cries of the enslaved. Each morning, his guards dragged him into the light to display him before the people, a daily reminder that Rome's might was not invincible. Yet every humiliation they designed only strengthened his legend. The Carthaginians sought to destroy a man. Instead, they had birthed a martyr. In the dimness of his prison, Regulus prayed to Jupiter, to Mars, to the gods of his ancestors. He did not ask for freedom, nor for death, but for strength to endure without shame. His captors, bewildered by his serenity, began to fear him in a way they could not explain. A prisoner who accepted suffering with calmness was more dangerous than one who resisted. Months turned into years. The Punic Wars dragged on, and Regulus became a forgotten bargaining piece, neither ransomed nor released. Rumors reached him through the walls. Roman fleets destroyed, Carthaginian generals executed, prisoners starved in retaliation. The world beyond his cell was still bleeding for the pride of empires. At times, the Carthaginian priests visited him, curious to see the Roman who defied despair. They offered him mercy in exchange for blasphemy, to renounce his gods, to curse Rome, to kneel before Baal's flame. He refused, and each refusal became another nail in his coffin. They left him in darkness, whispering that soon his body would serve their rituals, his death a message carved in flesh. Yet, in his solitude, Regulus found a strange form of victory. His mind, though frail, held to one belief, that suffering for Rome was nobler than living for himself. That conviction, cold and merciless, would become the very weapon used to destroy him. For his captors had learned that a man who cannot be broken by pain must be destroyed by his own honor. As the years withered his body, Regulus became something beyond mortal, a living ghost, half legend, half reminder of Rome's arrogance. And when the day came that the Carthaginians offered him a chance to return home, it was not mercy they intended. It was a trap woven from the very thing he worshipped most, duty. His torment was about to begin anew. Years had passed since Marcus Atilius Regulus last saw the sun rise over Rome. His hair had turned white, his body thin as a reed, yet his name still carried weight across the sea. To the Carthaginians, he was a relic, a symbol too valuable to waste, too dangerous to keep. And so, when negotiations over prisoners began, the Council of Elders conceived a plan as cruel as it was cunning. Regulus would return to Rome, not as a free man, but as a messenger under oath. He was to plead for peace or for the exchange of captives, promising that if Rome refused, he would return to Carthage to face his sentence. It was a calculated deceit. His captors expected the broken general to beg for mercy, to weaken Roman resolve. What they did not understand was that they were sending back not a supplicant, but a martyr. Before he departed, the Carthaginian priests forced Regulus to swear an oath to their gods that he would return, no matter the outcome. They believed their deities held dominion over all oaths, and that Rome's sternest soldier would tremble before divine punishment. Regulus bowed, but said nothing. His silence concealed contempt. For him, honor was not granted by gods of fire, but bound by the unyielding code of Rome. When Regulus arrived in the Eternal City, he was scarcely recognizable. The streets that once echoed his triumphs now stared in disbelief at the ghost who had come home. His family wept. His sons clung to him. But the Senate summoned him at once, expecting pleas for negotiation. The chamber fell silent as he entered, frail, scarred, dressed in the coarse robe of a prisoner. Then came his final act of defiance. Instead of pleading for peace, Regulus urged the Senate to reject Carthage's terms. He told them the Carthaginian captives held in Rome were strong men, warriors who would return to the battlefield if released, while those taken by Carthage were dying, unfit to fight. "Do not trade the living for the dead," he is said to have declared. Rome must never bargain with dishonor. The senators were stunned. They had expected tears, not iron. His words turned their pity to awe, then to shame. Regulus refused even to enter his own home, saying he no longer belonged to Rome, but to fate. He knew what awaited him, yet he refused any comfort, as if to prove that a Roman's oath was stronger than life itself. Historians wrote that his peers begged him to stay, that even the Senate implored him to renounce his vow. But Regulus, bound by his own code, turned away. His return to Carthage was not a surrender, but a sentence he chose willingly. The cruelty of the gods was nothing compared to the cruelty of duty. As his ship departed the Italian shore, the wind carried his final gaze toward the city he had served too faithfully. Rome would remember his courage, but not his suffering. For the man who placed honor above life would soon discover that the gods, Roman or Carthaginian, care little for virtue, only for blood. And Carthage was waiting. The sea was quiet when Marcus Atilius Regulus sailed back toward Carthage, but silence can be the cruelest sound. Each wave against the hull marked the slow counting of his final hours. Few men in history have walked so willingly toward their own execution. To his companions it seemed madness, to Regulus it was duty. The oath sworn to his enemies bound him more tightly than any chain. When the Carthaginian coast came into view, the sailors averted their eyes. They knew what awaited him. Even his guards, hardened by war, spoke little. In Rome, his return had already become legend, a story of unbending honor, told in marble halls to inspire new legions. But here, across the sea, his name meant something else entirely: vengeance. The Carthaginian elders met his arrival with cold satisfaction. They had expected him never to return, believing no man could value honor above life. When he appeared before them, gaunt, pale, yet standing tall, their astonishment turned quickly to hatred. His survival was an insult. His obedience mocked them. They had sent a message meant to humiliate Rome, and instead, the Roman had humiliated Carthage. According to ancient sources, Regulus was denied rest or food. He was led through the streets once more, but this time there was no jeering crowd, only a grim procession. To the Carthaginians, his loyalty was incomprehensible. To them, oaths were tools of convenience, broken when survival demanded. But Regulus had returned not as a captive, not even as a man, but as a principle made flesh. He was thrown again into his cell, darker and fouler than before. The guards whispered that their priests would decide his fate. In the stillness, Regulus prayed to the Roman gods, not for deliverance, but for endurance. He asked that his death might serve as a lesson, that Rome would never make peace with cruelty, even if it meant his agony. Days passed, and whispers of torture spread through Carthage. Some elders demanded a swift death to avoid provoking the gods. Others wanted spectacle, a slow, deliberate punishment to break Roman pride. The council debated not whether he should die, but how. Fire, blades, starvation, crucifixion, all were considered. Each method offered a different message to Rome. In the end, it was decided that his death must be theatrical, not merely fatal. Regulus had lived as an example. He would die as one too. The Carthaginians saw his unwavering resolve as blasphemy against their gods, an insult that required fire and pain to cleanse. As the guards came for him, Regulus did not resist. His steps were slow but firm, his face calm. To those who watched, it seemed he had already left the world behind. The man was gone. Only conviction remained. No one recorded his final words, if he spoke any. But it is said that the guards hesitated before touching him, as if the presence of such unbroken will carry a curse. They knew the torment prepared for him. So did he. Yet he did not plead, did not curse, did not look back toward the sea. For Marcus Atilius Regulus, the journey was complete. The return no man would make had been made, and Carthage was ready to deliver the price of virtue. They did not kill Marcus Atilius Regulus at once. Death would have been too merciful for the lesson Carthage intended to teach. Instead, they broke him in increments, hours into days, days into months, until agony became a ritual. The cell they placed him in was not built for confinement, but for disintegration. It was small enough that he could neither stand upright nor lie fully flat. The air was thick with the rot of old blood, the walls slick with salt from the nearby sea. Each breath burned, each movement tore his skin against the stone. The Carthaginians had learned something of Roman pride, that to truly destroy a Roman, one must not take his life, but his dignity. Regulus was kept in perpetual wakefulness. His eyelids were cut so he could not close them, his body exposed to the relentless African sun by day and the freezing night winds by darkness. Guards would pour seawater over him, the salt inflaming open wounds. They fed him just enough to survive, so his suffering would not end too quickly. The priests of Baal Hammon visited his cell at intervals, chanting that the fire god demanded humility. They told him that the gods had delivered him into their hands for blasphemy, that his pride offended heaven itself. Regulus remained silent. His silence, like a mirror, reflected their own cruelty back at them. The longer he endured, the more their faith seemed to mock them. At times, the guards whispered of fear, not for themselves, but for the city. To torture such a man, they said, invited a curse. Yet the council ordered that the punishment continue, for Carthage could not appear weak. A prisoner who would not break was more dangerous than an army. His body wasted away, but his will did not. The human frame can be stripped of flesh and bone, yet conviction is harder to burn. Regulus endured not through hope, but through defiance, a stillness that frightened even his tormentors. To them, he became an idol of endurance, the embodiment of everything Rome admired and Carthage despised. Years later, Roman chroniclers would argue whether the tales of his suffering were embellished. Yet even those who doubted the legends admitted that Carthage was capable of horrors beyond imagination. The truth, perhaps, was worse than the story. It is said that Regulus prayed not for rescue, but for Rome's victory. That he whispered, through cracked lips, "Let my death feed the fire that consumes them." The guards who heard him claimed his voice carried no hate, only certainty. They feared it. The council eventually realized that torture alone could not erase his defiance. Every lash, every deprivation transformed Regulus into something greater than a man, a symbol of Roman endurance that no pain could silence. And symbols, in the ancient world, were more dangerous than armies. So Carthage resolved to end it. His torment had not broken him, but his execution might. The priests decreed that he would die by fire and oil, the sacred elements of purification. It would not only kill the man, but desecrate the virtue he represented. As the guards came to drag him from his cell, Regulus rose unaided. His skin hung like parchment, his body bent and frail, but his eyes, those hollow remnants of a soldier's fire, still gleamed with defiance. The chains rattled, but they no longer restrained him. For what was left of Marcus Atilius Regulus could not be broken. At dawn, the city of Carthage gathered to witness what their priests called purification, and what history would remember as one of mankind's cruelest acts. The prisoner, Marcus Atilius Regulus, was led from his cell through narrow streets lined with silence. Chains clung to his limbs, but his pace was steady. Even in ruin, he carried himself like a Roman consul. To his captors, that was the greatest insult of all. In the temple courtyard, A great bronze cauldron had been prepared. Beneath it, the priests had built a pyre of cedar and olive wood, soaked in oil and resin. Smoke coiled upward, thick and sweet, mingling with the stench of fear. The crowd pressed close, soldiers, merchants, and children, eager to see the god of fire claim his offering. The priests chanted in the name of Baal-Hamon, their god of flame and renewal. They declared that the Ramang had blasphemed against divine order, that his pride had defied the heavens. To cleanse the curse he brought upon Carthage, he must be unmade by the elements. It was not punishment alone. It was spectacle, ritual, theology, cruelty disguised as sanctity. Regulus was stripped of his rags and bound to a wooden frame. His flesh was pale from starvation, his ribs visible like the bones of an ancient ruin. Yet his eyes, sunken, hollow, unyielding, fixed on the horizon, where the faint shimmer of the sea marked the direction of Rome. When the cauldron began to tremble, the priests called for silence. Flames roared beneath it, and the surface of the oil rippled like molten glass. Witnesses described a smell, sharp, metallic, and suffocating, that filled the courtyard even before the first drop touched the heat. Regulus spoke only once. Ancient sources record his final words differently, but they carry the same truth. He forgave Rome for abandoning him. "Let them learn," he is said to have whispered, "that honor is not peace." Then they lowered him. The crowd recoiled as the oil hissed and surged. The sound was unlike any human cry, a chorus of steam, fire, and flesh. Yet even as pain consumed him, Regulus did not curse. The priests, shaken by his silence, ordered the drums to beat louder, drowning the sound of human endurance. What began as execution became revelation, that a man could die without surrendering. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The fire devoured wood, the oil thickened, the air turned black with smoke. When at last it ended, there was nothing left but the stench of burnt cedar and a stillness that even the gods seemed to fear. Carthage had won its vengeance, but not its peace. In killing Regulus, they had forged his immortality. Roman traders who later heard the tale carried it back across the sea, and soon, in every forum and barracks, his name became a vow: better to die like Regulus than live in shame. The flames had consumed his body, but they had illuminated something darker, the truth that civilization, when it sanctifies cruelty, becomes no better than the barbarians it condemns. And in the heart of Carthage, the fire that killed one man left a shadow that would never die. When word of Marcus Atilius Regulus's death reached Rome, the Senate fell into a silence deeper than mourning. No messenger could recount the details without trembling. The story of the boiling pit spread like plague through the streets, whispered first as rumor, then repeated as fact, then carved into the conscience of an empire. Rome had lost a hero, but gained something far more dangerous: rage sanctified by grief. In the Forum, citizens gathered beneath the statues of old conquerors, demanding vengeance. Mothers spoke of Regulus as if he were a saint. Fathers told their sons that mercy was weakness. His suffering became a mirror in which Rome saw not its victimhood, but its justification. And in the hearts of senators and generals, grief hardened into something colder, the resolve to erase Carthage from the world. The Senate declared new levies, summoning legions from distant provinces. Veterans too old to fight offered their sons. Young men volunteered not for glory, but for vengeance. The temples were filled with sacrifice: bulls, sheep, even doves, each slaughter offered to Mars in Regulus's name. Priests proclaimed that Rome's gods had been insulted, that only Punic blood could cleanse the shame. The campaign that followed was not a war, but an exorcism. Roman armies marched upon Carthaginian strongholds with no intent to negotiate. Cities were razed, captives mutilated, entire villages put to the sword. Prisoners were crucified along the roads leading back to the coast, their bodies left to rot as warnings. When Roman soldiers captured Carthaginian commanders, they imitated the execution of Regulus. They built great bronze basins, filled them with oil, and burned their enemies alive. The historian Florus later wrote that Rome became the very cruelty it condemned. But to the soldiers in the field, such doubts meant little. They carried Regulus's name as both prayer and curse. Every flame that rose from a Punic village was seen as divine repayment. The vengeance of one man had become the vengeance of a civilization. Not all were blind to the horror. A few senators questioned whether Regulus would have approved of such slaughter. They remembered his discipline, his restraint, his sense of duty. But those voices were drowned by the roar of the mob. In a city that worshipped strength, compassion was treason. Regulus's martyrdom had become too useful to question, a weapon wielded by politicians hungry for unity through blood. Years passed, and the Punic War dragged on. Rome gained victories, but also debts and graves. The fields of Sicily and Sardinia were soaked with blood from both sides. Yet no cost seemed too high for vengeance sanctified by legend. Rome's poets called Regulus the flame that purified the Republic. Its generals swore oaths over his name before marching to war. By the time peace was finally declared, Rome had avenged its hero, but at a terrible price. Tens of thousands lay dead, and Carthage, though crippled, still stood. The Senate called it victory, but the veterans who returned saw something else, an empire that had fed its soul to the fire. The death of Marcus Atilius Regulus had not cleansed Rome, it had infected it. In avenging cruelty with cruelty, Rome proved what history would always reveal, that vengeance does not restore virtue. It only teaches the living how to kill with purpose. And from that lesson, the empire would never recover. In the years following Regulus's death, his name ceased to belong to the man who bore it. It became a tool, a symbol wielded by those who had never seen a battlefield, those who sought to shape the memory of his agony into the language of power. The Senate, the temples, the poets, all claimed him. Each retelling twisted his final moments to serve a purpose greater than truth. To the Senate, Regulus was proof that Rome's gods favored duty above life. His death was recited as an argument for obedience. Young patricians, rising through political ranks, invoked his name when demanding loyalty from the lower classes. To them, Regulus was not a man but a doctrine, the embodiment of sacrifice for the state. His suffering sanctified the harshest laws, the cruelest commands. If Regulus could die for Rome, then who could question Rome itself? The temple seized his memory next. Priests erected altars to his spirit, proclaiming him a divine martyr. In ceremonies, they spoke of visions in which Regulus appeared in shining armor, his wounds bleeding gold, his voice commanding Romans to remain steadfast. His story became scripture. Children were taught that disobedience was a betrayal of Regulus's ghost. In the name of the martyr, Rome's faith grew darker, more absolute. Poets and playwrights followed, transforming his agony into art. In the theaters of the Republic, actors wept before painted flames, reenacting his torture as crowds cheered. The audience was not horrified, they were inspired. The pain of Regulus became entertainment, a moral lesson dressed in spectacle. To see him suffer was to be reminded of what Rome demanded from its sons: total devotion, no matter the cost. Yet beneath the pageantry, whispers persisted. Among philosophers and scholars, questions arose, uncomfortable ones. Did Regulus's return truly serve Rome, or had it merely fed the pride of men too blind to see their own cruelty? Was his honor a virtue, or a weapon forged by tradition to enslave the conscience? Some dared to suggest that Carthage had not created a monster, Rome had. But such voices were dangerous. In the political halls of the Republic, doubt was treason. Those who spoke against the myth found themselves accused of impiety, stripped of rank, even exiled. Truth became irrelevant. What mattered was belief, and belief was power. The more exaggerated Regulus's legend grew, the easier it became to justify any act in his name. His martyrdom was no longer a story of one man's sacrifice. It was a manual for empire. As the decades passed, Rome's leaders invoked Regulus whenever conquest demanded moral cover. "Remember Regulus," they said before campaigns in Spain, in Gaul, in Africa again. His ghost marched beside every legion, his name whispered before every slaughter. He had died once, but his myth killed endlessly. And somewhere in the unrecorded silence between those triumphs and tragedies, the man himself was lost. No one remembered his voice, his doubts, or the weariness of his final walk. They remembered only the flames, the oil, and the steel of his conviction. The Republic had immortalized him, but in doing so, it had buried his humanity. Thus, Regulus did not die as a man of virtue. He lived forever as a weapon of statecraft, his suffering transformed into doctrine. And in that transformation lay the greatest cruelty of all, not what was done to his body, but what was done to his memory. Honor, the word echoed through marble halls and blood-stained fields alike. Rome had built its empire upon that fragile idea, convincing generations that the highest virtue a man could achieve was obedience unto death. Marcus Atilius Regulus became the perfect embodiment of that creed, not because he triumphed, but because he suffered. His agony was transformed into proof that Rome's way of life was righteous, no matter how merciless it became. But beneath the banners and rhetoric, a darker truth festered. The glorification of Regulus revealed that Rome's devotion to honor was not moral, it was pathological. To be Romain was to worship endurance, to find holiness in pain, to mistake cruelty for strength. The Senate spoke of duty while crucifying slaves along the Appian Way. Generals prayed to the gods for victory, even as villages burned behind them. And when they invoked Regulus, it was not compassion they sought, it was justification. The cult of sacrifice spread like a contagion. Young men in training repeated his name before battle, taught that to die screaming was noble if it pleased the Republic. Statues of Regulus appeared in academies and forums, depicting him serene amid flames, a lie carved in stone. In his martyrdom, Rome found a mirror that reflected its ugliest virtues and called them divine. Yet there were cracks in the illusion. Philosophers like Seneca and later historians began to question the cost of such virtue. They asked whether Rome's obsession with honor had become indistinguishable from madness. Was a man noble because he chose death, or because his masters demanded it? Could a nation built on endless sacrifice ever know peace? These questions, whispered in libraries and private chambers, marked the first tremors of Rome's moral decay. Ordinary citizens, too, felt the contradiction. They lived under laws that preached discipline, yet permitted cruelty, that celebrated justice, yet crucified dissenters. The same Rome that built aqueducts and forums also invented punishments that defied imagination: strangulation in the Gemonian stairs, starvation in cages, burning alive before crowds. And through it all, the story of Regulus was invoked as holy precedent. By the 1st century BCE, the Republic's moral compass had turned upon itself. Senators who quoted Regulus in speeches ordered executions without trial. Generals demanded total loyalty, invoking his name as a warning to deserters. Honor had ceased to be a virtue, it had become a weapon. Even the poets who once glorified his sacrifice began to sense the rot beneath the marble. They wrote of how Rome, once noble, had become addicted to spectacle, feeding upon its own people's suffering. They called Regulus the first offering, the seed of a nation that mistook torment for triumph. And so, centuries after his death, the flames that consumed him still burned, not in temples, but in the hearts of men who believed cruelty could be sanctified. Regulus's story was no longer about one man's courage. It was about the sickness that grows when a civilization confuses honor with obedience and righteousness with pain. Rome would endure for centuries more, conquering lands, enslaving nations, and writing laws that outlasted empires. But the moral wound left by Regulus's death would never fully heal. It festered beneath the grandeur, a reminder that behind every monument and victory lay a foundation of suffering sanctified in the name of virtue. And as history marched forward, the same lie would echo in every age, that cruelty, when cloaked in honor, ceases to be cruelty at all. Time eroded the empire that had once called Marcus Atilius Regulus its ideal. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, and yet his name endured, whispered by scholars, inscribed upon tablets, carved into fading monuments. But no grave ever held him. His body, dissolved by flame and oil, had left no bones for Rome to bury. His tomb existed only in memory, a silence that haunted every corner of Roman conscience. In the years after Carthage fell to Roman vengeance, survivors spoke of the pit where he perished. They said the ground there would not grow crops, that animals refused to cross it. The Romans, upon conquering the city, tore down its temples and salted its soil, believing they were purging an evil. Yet what they truly buried was not Carthaginian cruelty, it was the reflection of their own. The Senate declared Regulus a hero, his spirit enshrined in marble halls. But over time, that marble cracked. The Republic, corrupted by greed and ambition, devoured itself. Civil war tore through Rome like a sickness. Brothers slaughtered brothers, generals crowned themselves kings, and the Senate became an echo of its former power. In this chaos, Regulus's name was invoked once more, not as an example of virtue, but as a ghost of what Rome pretended to be. When Augustus rose from the ashes of the Republic, he ordered that Regulus's story be immortalized in public ceremonies. But by then, it had lost its meaning. The tale had become a ritual, rehearsed, hollow, unfeeling. Actors recited his suffering before cheering crowds who no longer understood what they celebrated. The pain that once symbolized integrity was now entertainment. In time, Regulus's likeness adorned coins and frescoes, yet no citizen truly remembered the man. They remembered the myth, the unwavering soldier, the unbroken martyr, the Roman who defied death. But myth has no voice, no conscience, no truth. It demands worship, not understanding. Beneath the surface of empire, thinkers and chroniclers began to write in defiance of that silence. They spoke of how the Republic had perished not from foreign enemies, but from its own worship of suffering. They saw in Regulus's fate the seed of every tyranny that followed. For when a society glorifies pain in the name of duty, it creates rulers who will demand suffering without hesitation. By the time Christianity began to rise from the fringes of empire, Regulus had already been transformed into a relic of an older faith. A symbol of martyrdom had a name. Early Christian writers, too, borrowed fragments of his legend, twisting his endurance into divine prophecy. The line between faith and fanaticism blurred once more, as the story of one man's torture became scripture for another age. And so, the tomb of Regulus remained unbuilt, not because Rome forgot him, but because it never truly understood him. His ashes were scattered into the air, carried across the sea that had witnessed his defeat, into the soil that would one day cradle the ruins of both Carthage and Rome. Perhaps that is fitting. For what tomb could contain a man whose death became a mirror to the cruelty of civilization itself? The silence that surrounds him is his monument, a silence that speaks of how history, in its hunger for heroes, often devours the humanity of those it seeks to honor. And through that silence, his story endures, not in stone, but in the uneasy conscience of every empire that followed. Centuries after the fires of Carthage had turned to dust, the story of Marcus Atilius Regulus still lingered, like smoke that refused to fade. To some, he was a saint of endurance, a man who chose honor over life. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a man devoured not by his enemies, but by the merciless ideals of his own people. History, ever cruel, could not decide whether to bless or condemn him. In Rome's later centuries, scholars continued to write of his torment with uneasy reverence. Cicero praised him as the model of civic virtue, a man who valued duty above the self. Yet even Cicero's words trembled with doubt. Could a life consumed by pain truly be virtuous? Or was it only proof that Rome's soul had grown numb to compassion? The philosophers of later generations wrestled with that same paradox, the thin line between moral courage and blind obedience. When the empire finally fractured under its own weight, Regulus's legend traveled further than Rome itself. Medieval chroniclers copied his story into illuminated manuscripts, gilding the margins with flames and iron. Monks in cold stone monasteries retold his suffering as if it were scripture. They called him Sanctus Regulus, the boiled saint, believing his agony mirrored the trials of early Christian martyrs. They prayed not for his peace, but for his endurance, as if pain itself were holy. But beneath those devotions, the truth of his death remained a quiet accusation. Every empire that came after Rome, Byzantine, Ottoman, Holy Roman, would in its own way repeat the same sin. They would sanctify cruelty, baptize violence in the language of honor, and claim righteousness in the name of the dead. The myth of Regulus became a pattern the world could not unlearn. Even in modern history, the echo persisted. Nations that swore they had outgrown the savagery of the ancients still sent men to die for causes they barely understood, still glorified sacrifice while silencing doubt. Statues rose, medals gleamed, and once again, the suffering of one became the comfort of many. Humanity, it seemed, had not changed, only refined its rituals. Historians now look upon the tale of Regulus with both awe and dread. They see in his endurance the best and worst of the human spirit, courage beyond measure, and cruelty without remorse. His story forces us to confront a truth that civilization prefers to forget, that beneath every age of progress lies a foundation of blood, that every virtue can be twisted into violence if men believe it sacred enough. No one knows where his ashes fell. Perhaps they scattered into the sea winds that once carried Roman fleets, or settled into the soil of North Africa where his captors once stood. But wherever they lie, they belong to more than one empire. They belong to every generation that has ever justified suffering as noble, every ruler who has disguised vengeance as virtue. Marcus Atilius Regulus, consul, soldier, prisoner, offering, was never truly freed by death. His body perished in oil and fire, yet his story endured to remind us that the line between glory and horror is thinner than history admits. His silence became testimony. His pain became prophecy. And long after Rome's stones have crumbled, his legend remains, a whisper from the flames asking whether humanity has ever truly learned the cost of honor. In the end, the story of Marcus Atilius Regulus is not about Rome or Carthage, it is about us. About how easily we mistake cruelty for courage, how willingly we sanctify pain when it serves our pride. His flesh dissolved centuries ago, yet his agony survives in every monument, every war, every oath sworn in the name of honor. The oil that consumed him still burns, not in fire, but in the hearts of men who call their violence righteous. History remembers him as a hero. Truth remembers him as a warning. For every age that forgets the cost of mercy will one day repeat the lesson that Rome learned in screams and flame, that no empire, no belief, and no God remains pure when fed by human suffering.